The ultimate values appear to me both to be incompatible and to be incomparable.
Today I want to talk about value theory, which is a branch of philosophy and economics. It's partly because the feedback I got on the previous videos I posted from friends of mine is that they really were more interested in the philosophical parts than the political parts. Another reason I want to talk about value theory is that there's a lot of turmoil in my country, which I won't get into directly in this video, maybe the next one. Many people keep saying the opposition party doesn't have ideas or vision. I mentioned an exception to that a couple of videos ago, but you put those two things together, I think there is a need for people to talk about philosophy. So what is value theory? In a way, it's the layer below ethics and below politics and other things. So part of why I want to talk about value theory is it's a bit like, imagine you have a problem in biology. If you drop down into chemistry, you might be able to explain what's going on and then go back up to biology to resume your original concern. A lot of political conflict, I think we can shed some light on it by taking a step back or a step down and talking about value. As a way into that, I'll mention one of my favorite webcomics, which is a strip called Dog Philosophy. It's a person talking to a dog saying, who's a good boy? Who's a good dog? And the dog is like, I don't know. It's a hard question. What is goodness? What does it mean to be good? And then the person is like, you are. And then the dog is very happy. So we ought to be at least as reflective and have at least as much humility as a dog. And we ought to have a deeper sense of what we consider good and what our theory of the good is, and not letting other people decide that for us. We're actually always surrounded by value-oriented language about good or evil, better, worse, positive, negative. My go-to example of a certain type of problem with this is the phrase, don't be evil. So it kind of sounds good, but it's not clear what it means. And once you notice that, you can start to see that everywhere. Politicians especially love saying, better, forward, progress. They either won't spell out what they mean, or they do, but it might be something more controversial or more debatable. So for example, Build Back Better was a recent bill. And I think a lot of it was climate change grants, which I tend to support. But it's still funny to me that, it was called Build Back Better because everyone likes betterness, but climate change is more controversial. We hide this type of deeper understanding of what we consider good constantly. Cost-benefit analysis, meritocracy, a developing country. Well, who's defining what is a good society? What should people be progressing towards? So, let's talk about it more directly. So this video, and I'm planning to make a essay or a blog post that covers the same content. It's meant to be a high-level overview of value and value theory, with some focus on value theory in the sense of Western philosophy, but also economics, and also touching on psychology, and ending with some discussion of politics and democratic theory. Some disclaimers. I'm not an academic, so I may get some things wrong. This is very high level. Please consult your local qualified philosopher, economist, psychologist. I hand wave some distinctions that you would want to linger on more, like the nuances between a value as an economic preference or a political priority, or a personal value, something that's more conscious to you. I do try to not exclusively cover Western thinking, but this video still does have a Western bias. So first, let's just kind of talk about the definition of value and value theory a bit. I think you should essentially define value theory as the study of anything that people value or have evaluations of. So it seems a lot like ethics, right? So why do we need a new word besides ethics or political philosophy? Because I would say people just do value many things that are not ethics, politics, religion. People value art, people value music, leisure, nature, convenience, gossip, social status, all kinds of things. And reducing normative discussions, like value-oriented discussions, to just some narrow conception of what counts as ethics is kind of missing out on a much bigger scope of human activity.
这个价值问题的提出，价值问题的提出 是人类生活实践，是历史本身。
And a quote that I love that kind of captures this is it's a famous quote by Emma Goldman, who's a kind of a political radical. If I can't dance, I don't want your revolution. You have to widen the scope of your inquiry to understand what people actually value. It's not just politics. Even political revolutionaries don't just value politics. You can get some of this flavor by going on Twitter or other social media whenever there's some kind of political controversy happening. And unless it's like a very big deal, it usually is not the most trending issue a lot of the time. People are focused on basketball, baking, celebrity news, the economy, whatever. How do we make sense of that, right? So it's the Emma Goldman thing. It's this idea that value is larger than ethics. It's larger than politics. Another one of my, favorite examples of that is one of the church fathers who named John Chrysostom. I think in the 400s, he was the Archbishop of Constantinople, and he was fired and banished to Abkhazia because he kept preaching against makeup and jewelry and dancing, and the empress just got sick of it. So it's important to have this broader view. It's also consistent with cognitive neuroscience, which I don't think has yet found a really moral region of the brain, or what we think of as moral activity. It just shows up in more general purpose regions of the brain that seem to be about value and social cognition. So things like the amygdala, which is more about like fear and aversion. I think the tempoparietal junction involves theory of mind, which sometimes is just social, other times it's more moral. What I want to talk about next is some basic distinctions and ideas that come from value theory and philosophy. Use those as we think about evidence in psychology about value. Then consider what are some other more normative philosophies that seem consistent with this evidence. And then later we'll talk about kind of a harder nest of problems, which is how do you compare different values as an individual? And even more contentious is how do we, in economic, social, political terms, integrate or fail to integrate different values or priorities or issues or needs that people have. I'm hand-waving some distinctions there. So we'll start with the personal and then go to the more collective towards the end. I think officially value theory is most strongly connected to philosophy and economic theory. So I'm going to just start with some of the philosophical distinctions that it produces. One of the big distinctions is the difference between a specific set of values, like a specific ethical framework, or even like a specific opinion on how to cook or how to make smoothies or something, versus the more kind of abstract analysis. For example, a hedonist is someone who kind of just is focused on their own happiness, perhaps, or they might have a broader theory where they think happiness is what matters in general and people should just pursue their happiness. We can see that as a substantive axiology. It's a particular point of view about value. But let's look at some of the more abstract terms, which can be helpful as we think about those. One important one is the idea that certain things just have intrinsic value. We understand the difference between human life has value and a fire extinguisher has value, right? Fire extinguisher doesn't really have intrinsic value, I would argue. I think it just has value because you can, use it to put out fires which endanger human life or animals or nature or property or things like that. So intrinsic versus extrinsic or I might call it instrumental value, like a fire extinguisher. And once we make that distinction, we might want to know, well, how many types of things have intrinsic value? So we started with an example of a hedonist, a classic dilemma for kind of simple approaches to value that say it's all just about happiness. How do you handle things like hurting one person to make other people happy? One person is healthy and 9 people need organ transplants. Even a hedonist, if you kind of prod them, they'll probably actually say that they believe in other things like bodily autonomy or non-harm, concepts like rights. So it does seem like a lot of people intuitively at least believe that there are multiple things that have value that are not the same. So we can call this pluralism or value pluralism. It's not technically related to cultural diversity, so don't get confused there. Although maybe there's a synergy, but value pluralism just means everything doesn't reduce to one type of value, right? The alternative we can call monism. We'll come back to that later. And if you believe that value is pluralistic, which I think a lot of us do, you start to have questions around how do you compare dissimilar values? So, we'll talk about COVID later, but, life versus liberty, intangible cultural value like ancient buildings and statues versus economic prosperity. It's hard to compare certain values because they are apples to oranges, right? It's not like 100 quarters versus $20. That has an answer, right? As a simple answer.
But in general, there isn't a single universal table along which you can place these values in a certain definite hierarchy, so that you always know what is more important than what, which value comes above which. Because the ultimate values, which a great many of us are addicted to, whether we know it or not, appear to me both to be incompatible and to be incomparable.
So a lot of problems come from value comparability, as well as political questions about who compares. And another important concept, well, I'll introduce this by mentioning a interview I saw with a famous psychologist who we'll talk about later, but he was asked, what do you consider sacred? It's kind of an interesting question. And what he said was, I might just play the clip, but...
And so as a secular scientific sort of person, sacred means inviolable. Biblically, it means set apart, kadosh, I think is the word. What is what would you would not trade any amount of something, for like your son's little finger. Like, it's horrible to even think about that kind of a question.
Right. So to me, what this is saying is, there are certain values like your child's well-being or your family's well-being that, you wouldn't trade for anything. It's not just that a million hamburgers and your child's health are apples to oranges. It's that one of them is just categorically better and more important. So that kind of idea that certain values do or should or for a person just trump everything else, we can call that value superiority, right? And it's not meant to be a judgmental thing like my values are superior to your values. It's more like life is more important than liberty, or liberty is more important than life, whatever. These issues are important because not just in our own individual lives, but socially and politically, economists, governments, social scientists will try, I think usually very earnestly and with good intentions, to compare and aggregate is another term, different values, but they have to make these judgment calls essentially about what matters and how you compare these dissimilar things, even if we might disagree with their own choices, their own judgments on that. One more term that I think is politically consequential is prudential value. Sounds very boring. It basically means like value for someone. So selfishly, you care about your own prudential value, like what's good for me. You can also be, altruistic or social about it, like, oh, I think that's good for her or good for her, right? And it can also be problematic, like, for example, a doctor saying we should involuntarily confine someone because they're mentally ill. It's in their own interest, right? That's a claim of prudential value.
就拿下雨好不好这个来看啊，这个是那个咱们著名的漫画家方成先生，他画的，他给这个大众哲学画的一个插图，下雨好不好？从这个图上可以看，下雨了，这个对这个拿着球要出去踢球的小男孩来说，下雨很不好，他很不高兴。但是对于那个拿着一个喷壶准备浇花的这个小女孩来说呢，他说下雨太好了。下雨到底好不好？ 这个是一个非常有谱，什么事情到底是好还是不好，是吧？到底是有用还是无用？是善还是恶？是美还是丑？是对还是错？啊，是祸还是福？是荣还是辱？你看牛肉，牛的质、牛的性格、牛的品质，和你解剖了以后的肉的、骨头的、是不是血的那些东西的。
All of that is philosophy essentially, but I think it's good for people interested in philosophy to try to ground themselves in evidence, scientific evidence. Even if science can't explain everything or make value judgments, you just want to know what the facts are. So let's take a look at psychology, and then we'll come back to philosophy in a few minutes. I'll mention 3 theories of psychology, one old one, which is famous, and 2 newer ones, which I think are more empirical. The old famous one, you've probably heard of, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It was proposed in the 40s, and it's been very influential. I think it's fair to say that if you interpret it literally with the hierarchy, that, basic physiological needs come before, more social and self-fulfillment type needs, that it's not empirical. But if you get rid of that hierarchical part, there is some validity to it. There's some studies about that. A more recent theory that it's not about value per se, but I think it's closely related, is moral foundations theory. One popular book about it that you may have seen is The Righteous Mind. They're trying, I think since the 2000s, it's Jonathan Haidt and other researchers that have been trying to decompose what we think of as moral behavior and activity into more atomic building blocks. And they call these building blocks moral foundations. The exact list of moral foundations is not set in stone. I don't think they're particular about that. One of their common lists has 5: care, fairness, loyalty, authority or hierarchy, sanctity, or sometimes called purity. All of these are loaded terms, and the definitions are a can of worms. So don't take it too literally. One of their main takeaways is that people weight these things differently within a culture, and different cultures tend to weight them differently as well. Some people really prioritize, care and fairness, and there are other cultures or other Westerners who kind of have more of a even weighting among those 5 or 6 in some lists. Another big result that they have claimed, I think people push back on it, is you can kind of predict left-right political orientation from how people weight in survey questions these different concerns, kind of like a political personality test. The argument in favor of that says that, liberals or leftists, which I think are all kind of problematic concepts, but self-identified liberals will tend to focus on harm and care. Conservatives might focus more on authority and loyalty. I've also seen people push back on that. Like, I think in Black communities, that correlation doesn't hold up as well, and it also actually depends. You have to be careful to define authority correctly. So I think in some studies, liberals do believe in hierarchy for what they consider legitimate authorities, and conservatives what they consider legitimate authorities. But they both become don't tread on me for authority that they don't like or don't consider legitimate. If we take a step back, you can I think notice that there seems to be a lot of similarity with MFT and a different theory called the Schwartz theory of basic values, or Schwartz value theory. It's not specifically focused on morality. It's more focused on value in general, but also on something they define more specifically as personal values. So it's things that you kind of consciously consider aspirational or goals, being dependable or benevolent or security or achievement, things like that. According to the most recent versions, I think there's 19 different basic values according to them. It doesn't look identical to MFT, but you can see some similarities. So there's some Schwartz values called benevolence, which includes caring. That looks a lot like care in MFT. Recently, there was a study that tried to run the surveys and models on the same research subjects, and they found that there is in fact a certain correlation between the two theories. There are also more kind of culturally specific versions of this same type of idea. So like the China Values Survey, the China Values Questionnaire, and they come up with some similar values and some slightly different ones or different emphases. You can poke a lot of holes at these theories But on one level, I kind of don't care. I'm just happy that people are investigating things like this in an empirical way, not just philosophers talking out of a bathtub. I still take it with a bit of a grain of salt because of the subjectivity of how you define these concepts. So to me, the point of all this research is not an exact list, but an impression of the types of things that people value and the appreciation that not only value, but even ethics more narrowly. It's not just one thing. It's multiple things. There's multiple things going on, even within a single person, and different cultures are different. One of the images that comes from moral foundations theory, I think is worth reflecting on. They compare the different moral concerns, or we could maybe even add the Schwartz values or other conceptions of different values to taste buds, different types of taste receptors, right? So some people like spicy food, some people don't, some people like sour food. What I love about this analogy is that on the one hand, we all have a kind of understanding and appreciation for diversity when it comes to the taste of food. So I don't believe everyone should prefer food the exact same way I do. But it's not really relativistic in the sense that anything goes. We do judge other people for their taste in food. And there are certain things that just everyone agrees taste bad.
And I think some of this is our fault in some of our early writings, where I think we kind of blurred the line between descriptive and normative. And so part of what we were trying to do in some of our earlier papers was say, hey, liberal audience, listen up. There's aspects of morality that you're missing, and you're not understanding conservatives right. There's a sort of assumption of, oh yeah, moral foundations theory. That's that theory that says conservatives are better people than liberals. Or, like liberals only have two moral things and conservatives have 5. So therefore conservatives are 3 more moral than liberals. And I think in most of our writings, we've tried to dispel that. I know when I give talks, I start out by saying, the word moral is used in a descriptive way and in a normative way. And so if I'm saying that these loyalty concerns are moral concerns, I'm using that in a descriptive way. But normatively, it sounds like you guys are saying that loyalty and authority are good things. Well, what about goose-stepping Nazis? I think they're morally bad. How come you guys think that that's a morally good thing? And then it's like, whoa. That's a normative argument that I don't want to be on that side of. And I do look back at some of our first papers, and I think, boy, it's really unclear exactly what we're saying here, and if it's descriptive or normative.
So what do we make of this? Let's come back to philosophy now. At least in the West, I think this type of empirical research about value, it kind of runs against the grain of Western ethical thought. If you've ever taken a Western philosophy class or an ethics class, you'll often hear of Immanuel Kant and Jeremy Bentham as kind of the two most influential thinkers in Western ethics, at least since the European Enlightenment.
We're going to explore in the days and weeks to come the contrast between consequentialist and categorical moral principles. The most influential example of consequential moral reasoning is utilitarianism, a doctrine invented by Jeremy Bentham, the 18th century English political philosopher. The most important philosopher of categorical moral reasoning is the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant.
So Kant is they call him deontological. It's basically about duty. And he kind of boils ethics down to something called the categorical imperative, which is kind of like a rationalistic way of saying the golden rule. So it's like, don't do anything that could not become a general rule, more or less. I grew up with a children's book called This Is What Would Happen If Everybody Did, kind of saying the same thing. And Jeremy Bentham is more about trying to maximize overall happiness, kind of like the hedonist, but more of a social aggregation of happiness.
The right thing to do individually or collectively is to act in a way that maximizes the overall level of happiness. Bentham's utilitarianism is sometimes summed up with the slogan, the greatest good for the greatest number.
They're very different, but they do have kind of a shared flavor, which I would call abstract monism, abstract theories that boil down to a single thing. And in the terminology we talked about earlier, we could call that value monistic. The psychology research we looked at, it's not like it's so slam dunk that you can still be a utilitarian or something, but it just looks less plausible. So I think it's useful to just remember what some of the alternatives are that can maybe coexist with this evidence more naturally. The oldest approach to ethics that was influential in the West is called virtue ethics. And it's been described sometimes as not even really an original theory, just kind of a formal way of expressing the intuitive way that a lot of cultures think about ethics. It's essentially an approach to thinking about morality that is more focused on character and on traits that we consider good because they promote human flourishing, and not so much on concepts of duty or obligation or rules. Virtue ethics was kind of the mainstream way that people thought about ethics in the West for centuries. It was discarded around the time of the European Enlightenment until 1958. A philosopher named Elizabeth Anscombe basically said, this kind of modernist direction in ethics is not working. We need to bring back virtue ethics. And
in 1958, Oxford philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe published a revolutionary and highly adversarial paper called Modern Moral Philosophy. In this paper, she argued that English moral philosophers did not differ from each other in any important sense. They all had given up the idea of a virtue, as well as the idea of happiness in the sense of fulfillment rather than pleasure. Obligation had become the central concept in ethics. But they had also detached ethics from a religious foundation. Anscombe's point was that the vast majority of English moral philosophers faced a dilemma. Either return to the idea that there is a God who legislates morality and is the source of our moral obligations, or else give up obligation as the central moral concept and go back to a virtue theory.
A lot of people got on board with that, including Philip Foot, inventor of the trolley problem. There are a lot of approaches in the West to thinking about value and ethics and what really matters that don't just boil down to a single thing. I'll mention a bit about Chinese thought. I have not read enough Confucius to feel like I can really characterize him, but I have seen other people describe him as kind of a virtue ethicist. We sometimes hear about particular Confucian virtues in the West, like filial piety, or Ren, sometimes is translated benevolence. But one more I'll mention that I don't think we hear about as often in popular media in the West. He really cared quite a lot about learning.
We, the Chinese people, for instance, have all along been influenced by traditional Chinese values. At least we pay lip service to them. We have inherited these values largely from the teachings of Confucius, as recorded in the Analects, and to a lesser extent from the teachings of the Taoist Lao Tzu, as expounded in the Tao Te Ching, which roughly translates as the classic on the way and the virtues. But talking about virtues, in Confucian teachings, benevolence is the core of core virtues. But benevolence as a virtue is highly capable of being exploited by the greedy people. So it must be regulated by wisdom, which is acquired mainly through learning.
Buddhism, I think, is hard to characterize, and monotheism as well. I won't really talk about, say, a few things just about non-Buddhist Indian philosophy. I am reluctant to say much about it because I think it's very diverse, and I don't believe I understand it very well. But there does seem to be a widespread agreement about four kind of basic values or ends, goals, called, I think I'm going to say this wrong, but the purusharthas.
Going back to this, the thing of making money, one of our principles our ancestors used to say was that to lead a good life, you need to follow the four purusharthas. right? And you need to find balance between all four of them. What are the four purusharthas? The first is artha, which is wealth, power. You need that, right? So, in India was a poor country for many centuries, and frankly, no one cared about how deep our philosophies were, right? So you need artha. Then you need
kama, which means pleasure or enjoying life, having fun in all the good things like love, and other good emotions and feelings, right? For example, playing games, okay? Maybe playing some football, for example, okay? Or eating some sweets, but don't overdo this much, okay? So you enjoy life, but do it in a balanced way. Don't play too much because you still also have to do other important things, right?
Third, you need dharma.
Something beyond karma and artha, expansion into a wider existence, doing something for others. Dharma includes morality. There are more technical explanations of dharma. Dharma also might mean religion. Literally, dharma comes from the root dhri,
which means to maintain or to support, has other meanings as well. So the literal meaning is dharati lokam iti dharma. That which supports or maintains the world is dharma.
And the fourth is moksha.
Now, what is this? Is it freedom from the cycle of birth and death, or is it freedom from sorrow? The answer is both. Both. The way it is taught in classical Indian philosophy, not just Vedanta, in Advaita Vedanta or in other schools of Vedanta, or in Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Purva Mimamsa, in Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, in all of them, moksha is the goal. One way would be freedom from the cycle of birth and death. And there's a paradigm of Indian philosophy. All schools of Indian philosophy, they will talk in that language. But there is another language in which they speak, which is freedom from sorrow, freedom from unhappiness, freedom from misery. And the two are not different. So moksha is also freedom from suffering. Both ways one can put it.
And those are the four goals of life in purusharthas. Okay? And that's basically it.
So what's the point of all this? The point of all this is that, going back to the start of this video, I was talking about how we're surrounded by value-oriented language, and a lot of it feels a bit evasive, or the details are missing. We shouldn't feel the need to be evasive because we have, a rich supply of details about what, in practice, empirically, people value. And philosophers throughout the world have, given us theories of value which are compatible with this evidence. So we should find it easy to flesh out, well, what do we mean by don't be evil? What do we mean by benefit or by merit? What do we mean by progress? So I don't think we have to pick a single school of thought. We can talk about care in scientific terms, and we can compare that to what is said in a more normative philosophical vein by Chinese philosophers about Ren, or bell hooks about love, or other people about love.
I particularly take his definition of love as the will to nurture one's own and another's spiritual growth, and link it to Eric Fromm saying love is a combination of care, knowledge, responsibility, commitment, and trust. Because one of the things that's happened in our culture is we equate love primarily with care.
And not limit ourselves to, especially in the West, not limit ourselves to these kind of austere, abstract perspectives on value. I think that's actually a good segue into talking about comparison of values, which starts to bring us back to political problems and social issues. I think an important instance of value comparison that we're all still grappling with, the fallout is still ongoing to this day, is what we all went through 5 years ago about COVID. I was in California, but every day I was watching the briefings by New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. And on March 20, he made the decision to shut down the state of New York. It was massively disruptive. And I actually kind of supported it at the time. I thought it was sensible. But he said something that rubbed me the wrong way, which is,
this is about saving lives. And if everything we do saves just one life, I'll be happy.
I thought at the time, and I still think, it's kind of a crazy thing to say as a governor, and he's probably just exaggerating, but we don't have that standard for almost anything. Tens of thousands of people die of the flu every year, but we don't shut down the economy. But I don't know what a better way to make that decision is. And if you said, okay, well, I'll be happy if we save 1,000 people. Well, how do you pick that number? I don't, So I think if we want to understand value, we should have some understanding of how these types of trade-offs are made, or that we refuse to make them sometimes.
There are many incompatible values. They cannot be combined. In order to choose one value, you have to sacrifice others. Sacrifice is always painful, but there is no escaping it.
So I'll mention two fields. Very briefly, just a little bit about neuroscience. It seems to be the case that when we have some type of trolley problem type dilemma, or do I want my kids to go to school for their development, or stay home for their health, or for the health of other people? Different regions of the brain might be involved in thinking about these different things. But to the extent that we make a decision, that kind of integration seems to happen in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex.
The trolley problem is a related set of philosophical dilemmas that has taken on a life of its own in research on human psychology and behavior. In the most common contrast case, known as the footbridge case, you have a trolley that's headed towards 5 people, again, a runaway trolley going down the track. You are on a footbridge. The only way that you can save the 5 people is to push the person with the very big backpack off of the footbridge and onto the tracks, and essentially use that person as a trolley stopper. They'll stop the trolley, but that person will die, but it will save the 5 people, right? And so there's a long-standing philosophical debate about what the right moral principles are, using these kinds of competing intuitions. I and other people, starting about 20 years ago, started using these as psychological probes, where we're looking at in people's brains when they're making these kinds of decisions, and trying to understand, well, what in the brain is pushing one way on the one hand and the other way on the other hand, and what can this tell us about the organization of moral thinking or decision making more generally? What we've found, and is consistent with a lot of other research, is that you've got sort of 2 different processing streams that are kind of meeting and then getting weighed against each other. What we did was we had people respond to these moral dilemmas 3 different ways. And what we found was that when we just asked people to report on which they feel worse about, you see increased activity in a part of the brain called the amygdala. So that is the kind of, that feels wrong, right? Then you have a different part of the brain. It's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this is a part of the brain that is involved in a lot of the kind of thinking that we think of as thinking. The kind of stuff that feels like a mental effort, that is often the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or in some cases, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. And what we see is that when people are just saying, okay, well, which is better in terms of cost and benefits, you see increased activity there. When you ask people to make an all things considered judgment, we see then increased activity in a part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And this is, we think of this as being kind of more on the emotional side of things. If you have damage to this region, the results are going to largely be about your not having emotional signals bear properly on the decisions that you're making, whether it's kind of gambling decisions or something like this in the moral domain. And what we see is, what it looks like is this is a region that takes factors that are, values that are represented elsewhere in the brain, and puts them onto a kind of common playing field or platform and says, okay, all things considered, what feels like the right thing to do? So you kind of have this cost-benefit reasoning rule, this feeling that the action is just wrong, and then those things get weighed against each other to make an all things considered judgment.
So some people even kind of use the metaphor of common currency. So let's talk about economics now. So in some ways, you might think that value in this kind of rich sense and economics have little to do with each other because we associate it with money. But at least since the 40s, economics has understood itself as not really being about money. That kind of was the initial self-concept of the field, that it was more about wealth or prosperity. But in 1932, there was an essay that was very influential that basically made the case that really what we're doing is studying decisions. We're studying situations where you have multiple ends that you might pursue, and you have a limited set of resources that you can deploy towards those ends, and you somehow have to decide, and you are essentially making value judgments about similar or dissimilar values, right? So it doesn't, none of that has to have anything to do with money. I'll put a quote on the screen that kind of lays this out. It sounds like existential philosophy. It has no mention of money. Everything he's saying applies equally to a barter economy or even just a single person. If you're Robinson Crusoe on an island and you have a limited supply of wood, deciding how much of it to use for fences versus campfires is an economic decision, not in the sense of money, just in the sense that you're kind of optimizing your choices or making trade-offs based on how you value things. And I like to extend that to not even material resources. And I think this is fair. I think this is included in his definition of economics, that you can spend your time, doing push-ups or reminiscing about your dead wife. That is an economic decision to the extent that you're trying to make the best use of your time. And so what this means is that even though the field does typically focus on money and material prosperity, there is a sense in which all of the values that we've been talking about for humans and even for animals, or abstract, deciders, are part of economics as the ends that motivate decisions. I think that's interesting, but it seems to me as a layperson that, and I have studied this a bit in school, but I'm not an economist by any stretch. It seems to me that economics has not quite nailed it, how to handle this heterogeneity of value. It's very strong on money, material prosperity. The softer stuff is more of a challenge. So I want to talk about that because I think it is important for understanding where we are in the modern world in thinking about how value is integrated, whether we like it or not, by governments.
Right. So one way to think about approaching hard choices, the first thing you have to do is you have to really sit down and think hard about the covering considerations that matter to the choice. Having said that, second, if the choice is hard, if the alternatives are on a par, if they're qualitatively different with respect to what matters in the choice, and yet in the same overall neighborhood of value, you might think the thing to do is to just flip a coin. Let's just flip a coin and go one way as opposed to the other. That strikes me as unsatisfactory. So what I suggest instead is that we need to expand our understanding of what it is to be a rational agent as something that isn't simply recognizing the reasons and the values that the world throws at us, figuring out how they relate, and then responding appropriately. Rationality essentially and centrally involves this other capacity. It's a capacity to put our very self, right, to stand behind something and thereby endow it with value or normativity. So we shouldn't think of hard choices as these horrible things. They're amazing things that we face in life because they're the junctures at which we get to express our agency. We get to stand behind something and add value to it. We get to direct our lives in a certain direction as opposed to another.
So why am I claiming economics has not fully figured out how it handles the diversity of human value? So one distinction that's important to make is economists generally see themselves as being kind of split between positive economists or theoretical economists. Positive economics tries to be more value neutral, and you can push back on that, but let's just say fair enough. And they delegate the more value-oriented and the more normative aspects of economics to what they call welfare economics or normative economics. Welfare here just means well-being. It's kind of an old-fashioned word for well-being. So let's consider welfare economics then. It just seems to be in flux. I don't know if calling it a bit of a mess is too strong, but there seems to be a kind of a difficult history and some lack of clarity in the modern manifestations of it. In the 1700s, I think they call the earliest forms of welfare economics old welfare economics, and it was basically a bit naive in the sense that they were influenced by utilitarianism, this ethical theory we talked about before. The thinking of old welfare economics was, to the extent that we're trying to apply economic theory to making a better society, we should do that according to utilitarianism. And what that means is that we have to theorize that every person has a utility function, or like a happiness function, so things that make them more or less happy. And then we hypothesize something called the social welfare function. So how happy is the society? And we can define the social welfare function, or they did define it as essentially the sum of everyone's individual utility functions, right? So it's kind of an intuitive but maybe simplistic way of thinking about the health of a society, or the happiness of a collective of people. You just get their individual happiness and you add it, right? In practice, it's really not clear how you measure any of that. How do you measure utility or happiness, and how do you compare different levels of happiness between people? It's kind of a philosophical problem. So I think in the 1930s, what developed is something they call new welfare economics, which kind of rejected that approach and started, in a way, it seems like a retreat, but they focused more on this kind of technical condition, which I won't go into detail, but it's called Pareto optimality or Pareto efficiency. It seems as though that move to Pareto efficiency in the 1930s has kind of been problematic in the sense that it has a number of logical problems that came up quickly, but also it's a bit aloof politically. Like, it doesn't seem to give much guidance on what would be a good direction for policy. In the time since the 30s, I observe what seem like two or three major strands in Western economic thinking about welfare economics. Maybe the mainstream, and especially in the United States, is a theory, a specific type of welfare economics called cost-benefit analysis, which was mandated by Ronald Reagan, I think, in 1981. The gist of cost-benefit analysis is that they get around the problem of measuring people's utility by trying to convert everything to monetary equivalents, basically. The move is generally that, if you're considering a policy, like, should we do some EPA pollution cleanup, or you try to calculate how people feel about the baseline and how people would feel about the policy. Like, some people are going to benefit or lose out from the change in policy. And then you try to calculate what is the monetary equivalent that would make people kind of indifferent between the two policies. Like if you wanted to pass NAFTA, for example, and factory workers are going to lose out, and finance is going to win, is there a dollar amount that you could bribe the manufacturing workers?
Right. The Counter-Hicks defense says if a policy passes the cost-benefit test, then in theory, there is a scheme of transfers from winners to losers such that everyone is better off. But often, policies that are picked up by CBA are not accompanied by any such transfers, right? So the losers remain worse off for the policy as compared to the status quo, right? And so it's hard to see that the sheer possibility of a scheme of compensating transfers, is a persuasive argument in favor of the policy.
It isn't just about money. It converts things to money, but it's not just about money or income or wealth. It tries, in a way commendably, to be multidimensional, so non-economic, so to speak, or non-income related values like health or life or dignity or quality of life, like pollution or something like that. They do all these studies to try to estimate how much do people value these things, in large part by trying to measure how much they would pay to avoid them, or they do pay to avoid them, right? But what it amounts to is that, number one, it kind of puts a dollar sign on almost everything. So for example, there's this concept in CBA called the value of a statistical life, right? It's about $9 million. It just feels a bit weird. And I think they're not cartoon villains. Like they're very serious, earnest people developing this theory.
The hardest problem, I think, that regulators who are concerned with social welfare face. It's the problem of non-quantifiability. The Department of Transportation fairly recently finalized a rule involving putting cameras in cars so people can see in back of the cars. And the challenge of that rule is that the monetized costs are just higher than the monetized benefits. It's a pretty expensive rule, several hundred millions of dollars. Some lives are going to be saved, but if you turn this into monetary equivalents, it just isn't worth it. The trick in the case is that there are benefits which the agency considered non-quantifiable, including the anguish that parents feel if they end up running over their own kids. It's about the worst anguish you can imagine. And they didn't know how to handle that non-quantifiable value, but they didn't ignore it. There's a second objection to quantification, which is that it might not be the right basis for policy. So we might think that the tool we have, which is standardly the willingness to pay tool, isn't the appropriate tool for evaluating a good that involves, say, human dignity. And that's a second objection. The third, which I think is the most interesting objection, points to incommensurability. Here we have a passage from John Stuart Mill, who didn't have full agreement with, in some ways, his intellectual mentor, Jeremy Bentham, urging that Bentham missed qualitative differences among human goods, saying that Bentham faintly recognizes as a fact in human nature the pursuit of any other ideal end for its own sake. The love of beauty, the passion of the artist, the love of order, of congruity, of consistency. Bentham doesn't get that. He kind of reduces them all to a single metric. This is Mill's ambivalence about utilitarianism. Okay, I think Mill's claim is deeply true, but largely irrelevant. The reason is that trade-offs are inevitable. And to engage in the enterprise of quantification, we're not providing a full or deep understanding of the goods, just trying to figure out how to make trade-offs among them.
But the conversion of everything to money, I think, doesn't sit well with many people. And it specifically has problems related to inequality. This type of mechanism ends up with the result that policies that benefit the rich end up being considered better than ones that might benefit the poor. It doesn't always have that effect, but that is kind of a bug in that theory. This is all just to say that one of the major disciplines for talking about how we measure and promote, or at least don't unnecessarily damage our social fabric and our collective well-being, is dominated by a theory which is contestable, has kind of problematic conceptual moves that involve putting dollar signs on everything that we might not want to, and kind of having a bias towards the rich. So we have this more mainstream approach to welfare economics, which is cost-benefit analysis. We have this other approach, which is influential, called social choice theory. And I think strictly it's mathematical, but it's often associated with a set of ideas called the capabilities approach to development or to social policy, developed in part by Martha Nussbaum, as well as Amartya Sen. And to me, the capabilities approach or capabilities theory, it sounds a bit like virtue ethics. It's a kind of pluralistic, multidimensional account of human flourishing, but more about, social policy or economic policy rather than, normative ethics. So instead of saying people should do this, they say people should be free to do lots of things. They should be free to express themselves, have, good health, political freedom, political equality. They're basically pushing back on this idea that we can measure society by GDP or even by income or median income or something like that. If you raise the GDP of Afghanistan, for example, and women still don't have political equality, the GDP only does so much. The prosperity only goes so far.
What do you think the priority for a country like India needs to be today? I think ultimately, in terms of priority, one has to see what makes a difference to the lives of people. And so growth is, after all, important for the sake of something else. Namely, it generates resources which could be expended sensibly, when it is sensibly spent, on enhancing human lives, education, healthcare. I think you need growth. You need growth not for its own sake. We have known from Aristotle onwards, as he said very eloquently in Nicomachean Ethics, that wealth and income are not what we are seeking. We're seeking them when we do for something else. And that something else is human life and how that could be enhanced. So development is the central thing. Now, there shouldn't be a growth versus development, because growth is one of the means of getting development. But you bear in mind that having a faster rate of growth is important, particularly because it generates public resources. And it's important especially when these public resources are employed in a way that makes a difference to human living now, the welfare, the happiness, and the freedoms today, and the future, by building up human capability to get employment, generate output, and so on.
Social choice theory and the capabilities approach are a lot of the thinking around things you've probably heard of, like the Human Development Index. I think Amartya Sen was kind of skeptical at first, but he got on board with it eventually. It's a kind of metric, like a blended metric that says, you know, these countries are doing more or less well based on certain economic metrics, educational metrics, and health metrics. This type of thinking, I think, on the one hand, is very compatible with what we've been talking about value pluralism and the difficulty of welfare economics to grapple with that. If I were to criticize it, I would say it's a good first approximation, but you're still, this type of thing still involves a single social scientist or team kind of making a value judgment for societies about what matters. Why does education matter at this rate to lifespan and to economics, right? Different people are going to have different preferences there. There's this tension in all of these theories around who has the right to make value judgments about what matters to them or to the average person. On the one hand, I think we probably should have, just my own opinion, more of this kind of focus in America. We talk way too much about GDP and not enough about non-economic or non-monetary, metrics of how people are doing. The rate of suicide in America has been rising. We have off the charts levels of opioid addiction, homelessness also increasing. So
GDP growth is nice, right? I'm not a degrowther who wants to go live in a log cabin, but that it's certainly not the be all and end all. And it's not even a very good proxy for a lot of the things that matter most. One thing that I've always found fascinating, and it's somewhat coincidental, but it's between the 2012 election and the 2016 election that all of the research on deaths of despair even emerged. And the basic assumption was still, the understanding of the invisible hand, as people thought Adam Smith spoke of the invisible hand, which was that there is some miraculous force out there that ensures that when everyone is left to pursue their own profit, the public benefits as well. The rising tide lifts all ships. And that is something I think, certainly I, to a significant extent, took for granted and just proved as an empirical matter not to be the case. We have now had decades for which that did not happen. And so I think the shift certainly that has occurred in my own thinking, and I think you're right, that is driving a lot of what's going on within conservatism, is a recognition that the ends that we're actually focused on, which you might kind of broadly describe in a vague term like human flourishing, has a bunch of specific elements within it. And high material living standards is one of them. But strong, stable communities, family formation, the ability of people to...
So it's not clear who gets to decide and how we define in some perfect metric how well are we doing in this country. But it's clear that GDP isn't cutting it. One last branch of economics I'll mention before going fully into politics is something they call happiness economics. So the nice thing about happiness economics is basically the study of well-being via direct surveys and things of that nature. And I think it's kind of looked askance at by many economists. But in its defense, what I would say is that people have a right to evaluate their own situation the way that they want, to say, I am or am not getting enough of the prosperity and intangible, social goods that I want. And that really isn't the responsibility of a social scientist. In other words, if all of the economic metrics say things are good, but people are unhappy, there might be something missing in those standardized economic models.
Rousseau said 200 years ago that man is born free and is everywhere in chains. And I think we could say today that we are born rich, and yet poverty and destruction is all around us. And this is the paradox, really. Why do we have an economy that doesn't deliver what is important for human beings? That doesn't deliver an economy that gives a sense of satisfaction, a sense of dignity, and also protects the planet so that we're not destroying the very basis of our prosperity. And I think the basic argument is we don't have our heads put on in the right way right now. The problems are not primarily technological. They are obviously political in important ways, but beyond politics is the way we think about the economy, the way we talk about it, the way we reason about it, the way we measure the economy. We're not fulfilling what we could be fulfilling. We also measure well-being. Now, how do you do that? By asking people about how they feel about their lives. So it's called subjective well-being. And we report this once a year as well, based on Gallup survey. Which are the top countries in this ranking? Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Netherlands, Switzerland, Sweden, New Zealand, Canada, and Austria, number 10. The list is almost identical. Balanced societies are happier places. The United States is way down on the list of both of those. We are neither sustainably developing nor are we happy. Here we're 19th. We started out 5th 20 years ago. We're now 19th because we're falling down the list. So my proposal is that eudaimonia should become the global ethic. It's actually Pope Francis's idea, but I strongly support it.
So let's end with a few remarks about politics. I'm going to keep it pre-2025, talk about more recent stuff another time. And I'll try to keep it brief. So I think it's important that we at least touch on politics, especially democracy. I think we should see, and some do see, democracy as basically a kind of value aggregation. But the theory of democracy that we all kind of learn in school and talk about in popular discourse is that voters have preferences, or they have issues or concerns, and they vote based on those preferences, and the government that gets elected somehow implements those. It isn't clear that that's happening in practice, and social scientists, many of them explicitly argue that it's not. So in a sense, everything we've been talking about doesn't matter. In your own local community and in your own life, your values can be manifest perhaps, but to the extent that we want the will of the people to be reflected in government, it really isn't clear that that's happening. So something is breaking down. Briefly, what I'll say about what that is that there are many kind of choke points in the American system of checks and balances and local control and so on, where you can either prevent something from happening through a mechanism or prevent it from even getting on the agenda in the first place. This happens with the wealthy. It also happens with special interests that are not necessarily wealthy. Environmental groups that will prevent housing from being built or high-speed rail.
Why can't we build the affordable housing? What did happen to California high-speed rail?
There's a whole slew of books recently that talk about this. So Abundance, Mark Dunkelman's Why Nothing Works. The bias towards action that some countries have has been so diluted in America to the point where it's almost impossible to break out of the status quo or to do anything new because people can choke off policies in so many ways.
What you need is a process where all of the proper concerns are taken into account. Everyone has a voice, no one has a veto, and then someone makes a decision. Someone says the cost of demolishing a historic building in order to make sure that this number of people can get into the city more expeditiously so that another 100,000 people have commutable access to this downtown or whatever, that is something that a trade-off that I'm willing to make. The problem right now is that progressives have created a system that cannot ratify a trade-off. It cannot it cannot accept the downsides of anything. And so we need a process that allows for government to do that. Like otherwise, government is essentially rendered completely dysfunctional.
And it's a real problem. It's not just a publishing fad. The word, I think, comes from Francis Fukuyama in 2014, Political Order and Political Decay. He was very harsh about how dysfunctional American government has become.
Compared to other developed democracies, we are way over at the far side in terms of the number of veto players or checks and balances that our system provides. And there's good reason for this. The founding fathers wanted to maximize individual liberty. They wanted to prevent tyranny from arising, and so they designed an extremely complex constitutional system in which power was split between many different parts of the government. So you have two houses of Congress we've got an extraordinarily powerful upper house that doesn't exist in many European parliamentary systems. And by the way, two countries that do have very powerful upper houses, Japan and Italy, have both proposed getting rid of them in recent years because they also have been deadlocked by the fact that their upper house can't agree with their lower house. We have federalism. We devolve power to states and localities. We've got a very powerful judiciary with the right of judicial review. And the checks and balances, those are all mandated in the Constitution, but they've actually been spreading just as a result of ordinary practice. So we have what I describe in the book as a vetocracy. I know that in terms of the American experience and American traditions, we are extremely proud of the fact that we have this system of checks and balances, but I believe that you can have a system with too many checks and balances, where it becomes extremely easy for a well-organized minority to use its influence through these institutional rules to block decisions by the majority. It blocks tyranny, but it also prevents the government from doing things like passing budgets, which we haven't done by our rules or by Congress's own rules really since 2008.
Another book I'll mention with a different diagnosis that I think is important is called Democracy for Realists. A lot of what they document is the way that voters they're not really behaving according to the theory. People tend to basically vote based on party, even if they don't really agree with the party platform. So instead of this kind of classic myth of, voters deliberate, they make choices and vote based on their values, preferences, priorities, what actually happens is parties decide what agendas are. Voters kind of pick a party maybe when they're young, they rarely change it, and then they just kind of vote in line with their party. The analogy I sometimes think of is like, imagine there were a ton of earthquakes and we needed everyone to put a app on their phone that sent their accelerometer data to, a government or something to try to do earthquake warnings, right? And then imagine that everyone downloaded the app, but then they just half the country copied data from like AOC, and the other half just copied the data from Ted Cruz or something. No offense to either of them, but we would be just losing out on all the data on what is actually happening. So it's like, I don't know how we would expect this to really work, right?
I mean, the U.S. has just become so tribal now, and it's you cannot criticize or give any constructive criticism to what's happening without getting blasted. And it's sad. It's like, man, like you guys have 100% lost all critical thinking skills. Like you're not fucking thinking on your own. And you are given the values that you align with. You're no longer going off the way you were raised or what's true to you as a person. I think a lot of people don't even fucking know what that is anymore. And they're just told. They're told, they align with the tribe. Whatever that tribe says, they're going to do, they're going to say, they're going to follow. And that's sad.
But there is evidence, there is real evidence for persuasion. People that switch parties between elections, it's people that change on particular issues. When I was much younger, gay rights, gay marriage was very controversial. And I saw in real time this evolution. And it wasn't just an older generation died off. People changed how they felt about it. So there is such a thing as persuasion. One of the studies that struck me was, I think it was a pair of political scientists that have studied, persuasion in political campaigns and how it often doesn't work. It's like a canvasser kind of knocking on a door and talking for a couple minutes. But one of the times where they found that it did actually work it was in South Florida, I think in 2016, and they had canvassers go out and have like 10-minute conversations with voters about transgender issues. And the goal was basically to reduce transphobia and I think increase support maybe for like a certain county ordinance or something. Maybe it was housing discrimination or something like that. And it worked. They measured it months later. People had actually changed their attitudes and support for that policy. And I respect people that don't want to talk to people they disagree with. I mean, certainly if you're more personally affected by them. But people did change their minds about gay people, and people can change their minds about other things. I believe there must be some role, some emphasis in our politics on good faith conversation and persuasion, to the extent that we want to actually share the values we have with other people that might not share them. We have to be willing to talk to each other.
But let's go to Zach. Zach, welcome in. Real snappy. Just tell folks where you are and what's on your mind.
Hi, folks. I'm in Oakland, California. I was thrilled to see that Oren was coming on. Coincidentally, I'm trying to post a video today, and I quote Oren, I quote you in the video talking about how GDP is not a adequate measure of social well-being. We need some more multidimensional account of human flourishing and so on. And I think we agree on that. My question for you is, how do you think we should be thinking about measuring social well-being? And maybe you can touch on things like cost-benefit analysis or whatever else. I think cost-benefit analysis is the mainstream in the government right now.
Thank you, Zach. Oren.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I would split into two parts. One is even just how should we measure economic well-being? Because I think GDP tells us something, but it misses an awful lot. And so on the economic side, even looking more at the distribution of GDP, what is the typical worker earning? Is their productivity rising? Are we seeing that distributed well geographically and so forth? All I think needs to be focused much more along the side of just what is the number. And then I think that what this comes down to is asking what is the ends, not just the means. GDP is not the end unto itself. In theory, we like it because we think it is correlated with things we actually care about. And we can have political debates about that. I think certainly for myself, for a lot of conservatives, it's things like strong families and communities. Are people growing up in a context where they can actually build a good life, support that family, raise those kids in an environment where they're then ready to go off and do the same themselves, enjoy increasing health, be able to live where they want, be in a community that is capable of providing for most of its needs and having strong social infrastructure. And so, those are all things that we can measure also if we want to. I always point out, we survey 60,000 people every month to get the unemployment rate right to 1/10 of a percentage point. If you surveyed 60,000 people a month on some of these other things, you could have every bit as granular a view of what's going on there. And I think we should.